Hello, JNUC, and welcome to the Anatomy of a Mac Attack. I'm Jaron Bradley, presenting here today with my coworker Matt Benyo. We operate on the Jamf Threat Labs team, focusing on finding new ways to detect malicious actions on macOS. And today we wanted to cover the anatomy of a Mac attack. We're going to try and stay away from a lot of the big buzzwords today and just focus on some technical rich details of what an attack looks like on macOS in a way that's friendly and approachable. We know that sometimes attacks occurring on Mac can feel like a theoretical thing because some of us are still under the impression that Apple devices are safe from malware, which hasn't been true for a fairly long time now. And today we're going to give some examples of this.
So this is a look at our agenda today. First, we're going to give you a quick crash course in the fundamental elements of a macOS attack from the perspective of an attacker. And next, we're going to take a look at the multi-layered protection that's offered in Jamf's product, Jamf Protect. Then we will take a look at a start-to-finish realistic macOS attack simulation. And then we'll take a look at that attack simulation and map it to detections that are possible with Jamf Protect and show you what we can see.
So first, let's get into the phases of a macOS attack. Generally, malware ends up being deployed with two different types of motivations. On one hand, we have the crime side, or cybercrime, and on the other hand, we have the espionage side. Both of these two sides of malware share similar paths to accomplish their goals, and we'll get into what makes them unique a little bit later. Two things you should know, though, before we get into this and kind of where you can map out where the paths of these two malwares intersect are two different things. One of them is the cyber kill chain. The cyber kill chain was developed by Lockheed Martin, and if you really want to get into learning kind of the paths and stages that attacks go through while attackers are carrying them out, you can look into the cyber kill chain and read up on it. It's really just a way to kind of learn about and map out exactly what attackers are doing and what phases they're in while they perform these attacks. Another good thing to familiarize yourself with on a similar level is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. This has become pretty popular over the past few years, and it even has its own categories and subcategories for macOS specifically. So there's a lot of examples in here of what attackers have done on macOS in the past. And this gets updated as attackers find new ways to attack the macOS operating system.
But we promised that we weren't going to get too far into industry jargon or things like that. So if we were to take these ideas of a map of what an attack looks like, if we were to boil it down to some fundamental ideas, that's what we're going to do next. So we'll take a look at what are the basic predictable objectives that an attacker is going to try to accomplish during the course of an attack. So at a basic level, the first thing is they need to find some way to get onto the operating system. Once they're on the operating system, they need to find a way to stay on the system. So that's what we call persistence. Beyond logging in and out of the machine or restarting the computer, what are the ways that they can stay on the system? Then once they're able to stay on the system, they'll probably want some way to have remote access or send remote commands and things like that. So that's the third objective. And then once they have all these things in place, then they'll be carrying out the ultimate objective. So that could be data theft or some other options that we'll get into here briefly. And then while they're doing all these things, they have an overarching objective, which is to stay hidden. So to dive into these, first, let's take a look at getting onto the system. So in the industry, we refer to these strategies for doing this as infection vectors. So most macOS infection vectors rely on what we call social engineering, or relying on the user to infect themselves. So this is really a testament to the built-in security of macOS that by and large, an attacker needs to coerce the user into conspiring with them inadvertently into getting around these security features. There are a lot of security features that we're referring to here. We're not going to go into great detail in those today. If this is something you want to learn about, definitely check out our teammate Stuart Aschenbrenner's session on macOS security tools. That's also at JNUC. If you want, the main feature that we will focus on today, though, is called Gatekeeper. So Gatekeeper, you're probably familiar with this, but I like to think of Gatekeeper as essentially a border guard that's on macOS. And Gatekeeper is primarily concerned with applications that have been newly downloaded onto the operating system. So when an application is launched after being downloaded from the internet outside of the App Store, Gatekeeper performs a few checks. It's looking for a few different things. First, it's looking to see that the application that's running is signed by known and trusted developers, known and trusted by Apple themselves. There's also some AV scanning, antivirus scanning that's going on to ensure that there are no known signatures of known malware that exist within the application. And then thirdly, the code signing checks that Gatekeeper does are also able to ascertain to a large degree whether the application has been tampered with. If an application that's legitimate gets tampered with in some way, maybe a backdoor or something like that gets placed in it, generally that's going to break the code signing information and be called out by Gatekeeper. So this is a really powerful feature of macOS for any application that's downloaded outside of the App Store. It also gives Apple the ability to revoke that trust. So if a developer suddenly becomes an untrusted developer, without having to issue a whole operating system update, Apple is able to quickly communicate with Gatekeeper across macOS systems to revoke certain signing licenses from certain teams, so that if an application that's now from an untrusted developer tries to run, it will no longer be allowed by Gatekeeper. So if you're an attacker, one of the main things you have to get around onto a system is Gatekeeper, and you have a few ways of doing this. The first would be to actually sign the malware. Obviously, that creates a bit of a paper trail. It costs money to get a developer license to do that. And once your cover is blown, you have to essentially start over. So we do see this a fair amount of malicious developers, especially in adware, just kind of blowing through these signing certificates. Another more common way that you would see this is rather than signing the application, you would essentially try to convince the user to work around work around Gatekeeper. We'll talk about how this is done in a moment here. Or third, you do some really intense research and you find a loophole, some type of a complex bypass that was missed by Apple and other researchers, either by buying it from like a black hat security researcher or by doing the research yourself. And generally, once these are caught, they get patched in the operating system. So we generally only see these in very targeted operations. So in terms of coercing a user, one of the most common ways that we see this being done is on the internet. You go to, let's say someone is trying to illegally stream a football game or something like that. They'll often see a alert that they need to update a piece of software on their computer. Often it's Flash. Now, if you're a Mac admin, chances are you probably know that Flash has been deprecated for a while at this point. So what this serves to do is it's able to essentially, convince a user that they need to do something, but it's also filtering for users that are a little less experienced. So if you're filtering for users that are less experienced, they're probably more likely to fall for some of the other later stages of this attack. So they convince the user they need to download and install something, and essentially because the user is dependent or thinks they're dependent on doing this thing to get to whatever they're trying to watch, often they'll go along with it. An attack vector that's a little bit more common for maybe more experienced users would be someone who's trying to download illegal software via something like a torrenting website. So this is especially common for things like video or music production software. Someone goes on something like the Pirate Bay to get a free copy of Photoshop or whatever the case is. They download it, and while it seems like they have a working copy of Photoshop that they didn't pay for, what they don't realize is that within that application, something has been, maybe a backdoor is put in or a Bitcoin miner or something like that. So there's essentially stowaway malicious code that's placed inside there. And an example of how this kind of plays out, this is an example of something we run into a lot with these types of applications, is that they'll open up the downloaded application that they downloaded illegally, and they'll see something like this, where it's literally a prompt for the user to click on what's called a gatekeeper-friendly option, which really just runs a script that essentially works around Gatekeeper. And the thing is, a user in this position is more easily coerced to go along with what the attacker is doing because they already know they're doing something illegal. So the psychology of this is all kind of interesting as well. They're a little bit more willing to be complicit in this situation. Another extremely common vector for this type of malware is going to be email. So we generally think of phishing when we think of email threats. And that's super common. Generally, phishing is looking to harvest credentials from a user. But honestly, malware is pretty frequently distributed via email as well, whether it's through a direct download link or through some type of disguised executable. So often these things are hidden in things like Office macros. There's a script in an Office document that essentially runs when you open it, or things like executables that are disguised as PDFs we've definitely seen in the wild as well. So this is a threat vector that's really common, but one that people don't think about a lot for malware. So that's objective number one. Find a way to get on the system, find a way to run, don't get shut down by Gatekeeper.
So objective number 2 is going to be staying on the system. So we need a way beyond just when we get onto the system. We need a way to ensure that when the system reboots, or if our backdoor is killed, that it's going to restart again so that we can maintain a connection. This is what attackers are always thinking. So legitimate applications also need to persist. This isn't like a malware-specific thing. You think about Jamf Pro, right? You want to be able to admin your systems. They have to be running the Jamf software, and they have to be doing it every time the system boots up. So similar to the way that legitimate software persists, malware has not gotten overly creative here when it comes to persisting as well. In most cases, we see malware using a launch plist. Which is a very standard and the Apple encouraged way of persisting your software on a system. So similar here, you can kind of see when we want to run startup, we can provide a plist or a launch agent in the correct location, as well as point it to the process that it should be running in the program argument. So launch agents generally run in a user context with user permissions when the user logs in. Launch daemons, on the other hand, run as root, and they run in the system context. So they're basically, they kick off when the computer turns on before anyone is logged in. So naturally, the system context and these launch daemons are more appealing to attackers, but they're also harder to get to because they require root permissions. So we either have to trick the user into giving us root permissions in some way, or we have to come with some type of exploit handy to escalate privileges. So running a launch agent is a little bit easier to do, and quite frankly, even if you're running inside user permissions, there's still a lot you can do. But having malware run with root permissions makes it much easier to hide and access possible information that you couldn't otherwise access as a basic user. But we'll get more into that later. Login items are another way to persist. If you go into your and look at your users and groups, you can see here that you're actually given the option, hey, do you want to start some applications when you log in which case you just add them here. Ventura has promised us that this is coming for launch agents and launch daemons as well, so we'll be able to kind of see these in a GUI format, just like we can with these login items, which will be super handy because right now really only power users kind of know how to view the launch daemons and launch agents that are installed on their system. So good updates coming from that front. There's other methods, of course, of persistence. You can use more job-based stuff like cron tab or periodic scripts and so on, but these are not as customizable or reliable as launch plists. So we as analysts monitor these persistence items because they're often a good way to spot suspicious software.
So that's the second objective, finding a way to stay on the system. So the third thing that an attacker is generally going to want to do is find some type of remote control. So this is done via what we generally refer to as a command and control server, or C2 for short. So the types of things that you would do with a command and control server would be sending remote commands to the target machine, spying on the user. Maybe you're tapping into microphone, maybe you're capturing keystrokes, or maybe you're doing just simple things like stealing files from the system. So command and control for an admin is pretty similar to something like Jamf Pro. It's kind of like an MDM server. The basic concept is there. You have a centralized server. It's communicating with an agent on target systems or a system, and is performing specialized tasks as handed down from the command server to the agent on the target system. So there are a lot of off-the-shelf options that are very similar to what you'd think of as like an evil Jamf Pro, and there are, for example, one really common one is called the Mythic framework. So this is a post-exploitation framework that handles both sides of the operation. It handles setting up the attack server and also the components that would run on the target machine to carry out the attack. So as soon as the agent is set up on the target system, it's just like enrolling into a malicious MDM. Suddenly you can send remote commands that get sent down. You can pull down files, whatever you need to do remotely, all generally outside the purview of the user on the other side. So that's setting up remote control.
So the attacker makes it onto the machine. They have persistence. They have remote capabilities. So what are they going to do with these powers? Going to quote unquote do bad stuff. Again, on the crime side of bad stuff can mean a lot of things. It could mean adware, installing adware on the system and then getting off it and just making money off ads. It can mean mining crypto with the CPU. Ransomware, we haven't seen a lot of this on macOS, but it is there. It is possible, just maybe the market share isn't quite worth pursuing this kind of big game hunting approach on macOS just yet, but we've seen some of it, and I'm willing to bet we'll see more upcoming. And then finally, hacktivism. This could kind of count as its own category, as hacktivism is usually getting onto a system, stealing data for the sake of leaking that data, maybe embarrassing a company or political group or whatever. Could almost be its own category and somewhat falls into both sides of the scenarios here. On the other side, though, we have espionage, which could be much more spy-focused kind of features. That could be audio and video capture from the system, logging keystrokes to get company secrets or passwords, sending remote commands to that computer to accomplish stuff, and then finally, of course, the ultimate objective is generally data theft of intellectual property, and usually on the espionage side, you're in it for the long game to steal information over a long period of time and remain just silent and hidden on the system. So on the crime side, we generally have more financial focused goals, and on the espionage side, it's usually more theft of trade secrets.
So lastly, this one is less an objective so much as is a general directive, but an attacker is going to want to stay hidden. So the longer that malware can go without raising suspicion, the higher odds it has of completing its other objectives. So attackers have the responsibility to themselves to hide from both the user, but also any of the defenses that the user has installed. So sometimes these goals of hiding from the user and hiding from the defenses that are installed can be a little bit competing. So these tactics can be really simple ones, or they can be sophisticated. So something as simple as starting a file name with a period on like a Unix system like macOS, that's going to hide that file of your malware from something like Finder. Another one we already kind of hinted at with the email example is a false extension type. So maybe you've got your executable in an email or some other part of the operating system, and that executable, you give it a PDF extension. And even though it's not a PDF, the operating system will honor it as a PDF, even though, ultimately it's an executable. So I mentioned that those two goals of hiding from the user and the defense systems can be a little bit competing. So maybe you aren't obvious, because you're hiding. But what's interesting is that from a defense standpoint, these evasive maneuvers actually lead to some of our best detections, because if something is using a contradictory file extension like that, there's not really much of a benign explanation for why a program would do that. So for them, in most cases, that type of behavior is generally a smoking gun when it comes to detection. So this is good news for anyone who's using security software that's looking for these types of behaviors. So, of course, there are more than just these objectives. There are things like escalating to a higher level of privilege on the system, maybe moving from system to system laterally. But if we're focused on macOS and getting started on wrapping our heads around how this stuff works, this is a really good place to start if you understand these things. So it's also worth thinking about, if you look at this list here, the attacker has to string together a lot of events in their favor going wrong for all of these things to work. So I like to think of an attack as kind of like an elaborate Rube Goldberg contraption. So they rely on a user who's running an unpatched operating system, and the user maybe doesn't know any better, and they click on a malicious link and they give their credentials when asked. And the good news is that a lot of these attacks are so convoluted that they give us multiple opportunities to thwart or detect what's attempted. We don't need to necessarily catch every single step of an attack, but since these attacks generally have multiple steps, we have more and more opportunities to catch on that something is awry.
So that's where Jamf Protect comes in. Let's talk about what we're doing here at Jamf to detect some of these different threats. So the approach we take is a layered one. Remember that there's also a layer 0 here, that's the built-in security of macOS. But ultimately where Jamf Protect comes in is, first we're going to monitor security benchmarks. We're also going to prevent known threats from malware that's been discovered in the past. And then we're also going to detect based on malicious behaviors as well. And each of these serve their own purpose. But starting with monitoring security benchmarks, we have this feature called Insights. So essentially, these are benchmarks developed by the Center for Internet Security. Recommendations designed to reduce the attack surface or limit the number of opportunities for an attacker to succeed. So the more you have enabled, the bigger your Rube Goldberg contraption is, causing a higher chance of failure somewhere for the attacker. These are enforced via Jamf Pro. We like to say no system is perfectly secure. A lot of admins will try to balance the convenience to security levels, and that'll be specific based on the environment that these are applied in. So next we have the ability to prevent known threats. These are powered by ESF. Luckily, Apple has made it pretty easy for us to build on top of Xprotect, which is kind of their antivirus engine. We can kind of further expand on this using the endpoint security framework. ESF allows us to analyze and approve processes before they're actually run. So in the event that a process runs and fails one of our checks, this would be us scanning it, we're allowed to deny authorization, and the process is not permitted to proceed. So we'll also display a notification to the user, let them know this block has taken place. And again, this just lets us kind of like natively blend in with the operating system and just kind of run these scans in real time as applications are open. So let's talk briefly about the split-second analysis that's happening when a process is actually initiated. So we have three different kind of approaches, three main different approaches for our threat prevention analysis. The first is going to be team IDs. That's us blocking developers that have been associated with malware in the past. So once we find malware that's signed by a certain developer, we're going to say this developer has lost credibility, and all of their apps that work, we're going to block and keep them from running. It's an aggressive approach, but it's one that we find works fairly well. The other thing we can block and scan for really easily is going to be file hashes. This can be thought of as like a fingerprint. So a file has a specific fingerprint where we can identify it based on its bytes, and hash it. and determine if this file is an exact match to a file that we've seen in the past. The issue with file hash scanning is that it just takes the shift of a single byte, and the whole file hash or the whole fingerprint is now different. To kind of account for this, we use YAR rules, which we write, and we can look for byte strands or certain strings in a file, and these kind of allow us to scope in on malware families rather than specific malware files. So all three of these are very effective ways that we're able to quickly scan and determine if we want to allow something to run or not. So detecting malware based on known indicators is very reliable, but it does come with the problem that in order to know something is malicious, someone first has to discover it, and therefore a handful of people usually have to get infected first. For this reason, we also create detections based on malicious behaviors.
So we call these detections behavioral analytics in the Jamf Protect product. And we also use the endpoint security framework to do these detections, but it's in a slightly different way. Let me show you an example. So this is a technique called a plist disguised as Apple. So malicious launch daemons and launch agents will often disguise themselves to try and blend in with the operating system by labeling their launch agent and launch daemon plist with the com.apple prefix. So to detect on this, what we look for is we essentially create a sensor that's looking for the creation of a new launch plist. And so the first thing that we look for when this launch plist is created is to check the name of what that plist is. So in this case, it's going to be com.apple. So that's the next thing that we're looking for. So to determine whether or not this is something that is legitimately owned by Apple, what we can do is actually use some proprietary capabilities within Jamf Protect to look inside that plist and parse through the XML that's in there and hone in on the executable that this plist wants to run. So we go to, essentially we're presented with a path there. We go to the executable that's at that path. And with that executable, we perform a code signing check to determine, is this something that's actually signed by Apple? So we do the code signing lookup, and in this case, we would determine that it's not signed by Apple. So this is pretty much a smoking gun. We have a plist that's using a com.apple prefix, but the executable that's trying to run is neither signed by Apple nor signed at all, and that's a huge red flag. We confidently pop an alert to the user or to the console for further analysis. So to recap, we're detecting on the creation of a launch agent or launch daemon that has a plist that begins with a name with com.apple. The executable that it runs is not signed or owned by Apple. So we've used this detection for many different families. We've discovered lots and lots of different malware using this, and we're confident that there's malware that has yet to be written that will attempt to use this technique. So what's cool about that, and is a very strong testament to the power of behavioral detections, is since we're looking for this technique being used, as opposed to the fingerprint of a specific file, it means that we have the potential to discover new families of malware that have yet to be written. And really, that's the power of a behavioral detection. So those are the core components of Jamf Protect. First, we give you insights into which security benchmarks that you have enabled to limit your overall attack surface. And then we protect you from known malware by augmenting the built-in X-Protect rules, using our own in-house research, using custom-built YARA rules, and these are things that are updated essentially on a daily basis. Then we also alert on behaviors indicating known malicious tactics. So now that we've laid the groundwork in terms of laying out the anatomy of an attack and how Jamf Protect is able to pick up on those different aspects of an attack, let's move on to my favorite part of the session, which is a realistic Mac attack simulation.
So here we're going to be targeting an HR employee at a company called, let's say, Banff. No relation to Jamf. Our goal here is going to be to steal confidential information from the company, which puts us in the espionage category of an attack. The predictable objectives we discussed earlier can serve as a template for us to kind of outline this mission. So let's start to fill this in. We already know that the bad stuff we intend to do is steal confidential documents from an employee's Mac. So let's start there. How are we going to send remote commands to search for this type of data? Well, we're going to do that using what we mentioned earlier, the Mythic C2. And then how are we going to get onto the network, the victim network, to even begin with? For this, we're going to build a fake app, and we're going to distribute it via email. And then how are we going to stay on the system? Well, to stay on the system, we already kind of gave an example of what suspicious persistence looks like. And the Mythic C2 even has a feature to kind of go after or that will trigger on the example we gave. So in this case, we're just going to do a smash and grab. We're just going to try and get on the computer, find confidential information, and then just get out and not even worry about persistence. So finally, how are we going to stay hidden? We're going to do this by using fileless execution. In other words, the malware or stage 2s that we're going to download with Mythic, we're not going to write those to disk. We're going to do some living off the land, which we'll get into in a little bit.
So let's take a look at this playing out. The user receives an email that seems to be from IT at their company, and it says, "Hi everyone, as we know, it's important to keep our software secure and up to date. We understand that taking the time to track and update all your applications can be a chore, not always top of mind. Many of you have heard by now, in an effort to streamline this process, we're rolling out a convenient all-in-one application updater. You now have the freedom to run this single updater to manage all of your application updates when it's most convenient to you. Please download the application here." So it's using something that seems like a plausible reason, a plausible thing that IT might be monkeying about, sending out a new application updating scheme. It seems plausible, especially someone who maybe doesn't pay attention to a lot of the emails that, someone like IT sending out. So the user sees this email, they decide to go ahead and click on the link. The app downloads automatically, it's unzipped automatically by Safari, and the user is prompted to open using this alert, and they go for it. And when the app launches, their apps appear to be updating, and our Mythic agent is already running. So meanwhile, on the other side of the world, here at the Hilton Bayfront, let's say, our Mythic server receives a new callback from our victim machine. And as you can see, we have a handful of ready-to-use capabilities. So we'll start by checking the ID of the user by sending a shell command of ID. And it takes a moment to process, and we receive the result. So before we're too hard on the user, let's recall that all they did was they clicked on an email that seemed to be from IT. And as soon as they clicked on this link, it automatically downloaded an application, and then they were prompted from what seemed like the operating system to open that application. They did so, something that they probably do every day. So let's break down this Rube Goldberg contraption that allowed us to pull this off. So the prompt that launched the application was accomplished using a macOS feature called a custom URL scheme. So this is something that should be familiar to all of us. So it's a way to allow a browser to control certain applications. So for example, when we click a Zoom link in a calendar, it opens up in the browser, and then the browser gives us this prompt to open the application once it has the user's approval to do so. So Apple Music does this, Spotify can do this. It's a really convenient feature. And one of the craziest aspects of a custom URL scheme is that an application is able to register this URL scheme with the operating system the moment it hits the disk. How does it do this? LSD. No, not the LSD you're thinking of. I'm talking about the launch services daemon. So the launch services daemon is constantly running. So for example, when you specify to the operating system that you want all of a certain type of document to be opened by, let's say, Microsoft Word, for example, that's the launch services daemon that's handling that. LSD also registers new URL schemes. So if you recall, an application is actually just a bundle directory. And inside that bundle directory is something called an info plist that contains a ton of information about the application, including possible URL schemes. So LSD is constantly running. It sees an application has hit the disk. It goes to the info plist. It scans through it, and it finds that within this application is this URL scheme called software update. It registers that. So we, as the attacker, know that as soon as our application hits the disk, we can, from the browser, then reference that URL scheme to have the user essentially asked if they want to open the application. So we call it as soon as it hits the disk. The user receives this prompt. We've essentially lowered the friction as low as possible for the user to then click on that and then open our malicious application.
So just to be clear, our malware dropper was not signed or notarized. So even though the user opened it, Gatekeeper should have intervened and displayed an alert, somewhat like this alert. But of course, we didn't see that happen. We didn't see Gatekeeper trigger and tell the user no. This is because we've actually modified the zip file to abuse a Gatekeeper bypass that has existed around the time we were putting together this mock attack. Our team discovered that you could bypass Gatekeeper if you managed to tweak the first local file header within a zip file, which would ultimately break zip file parsing and keep the quarantine extended attribute off of our download application. This extended attribute is what actually tells Gatekeeper that it needs to scan this file. And before anyone goes accusing us of spreading fear, uncertainty, and doom, the Jamf Protect team reported our findings to Apple immediately, and this loophole was promptly patched in macOS 12.3. So as long as your Macs are patched to 12.3, this portion of the Rube Goldberg attacker contraption would not have actually been successful. The story behind this particular vulnerability and its discovery can also be checked out here at JNUC at a talk given by our own Ferdows Seljuki. If you want more technical details on how that vulnerability worked and how it was exploited, feel free to go check out that talk as well. So this user was running an unpatched version of macOS, which is why the zip file they downloaded from us didn't trigger Gatekeeper. LSD registered the custom URL scheme. Our website then called it and prompted the user to open the app, which they did, and we were off to the races. So now that we've covered how we got onto the system, let's jump back to the attacker perspective and carry out our smash and grab. For this portion of the attack, we don't even need to know what we're looking for. All we need to know is that there's files on the Mac that are designated confidential. We know that if any of these files exist, we want to grab them. So the best part is, with our ability to send remote commands to the Mac, we can actually try and do this all through a single one-liner command. How, you ask? Well, that'd be through the magic and power of Spotlight. So we don't exactly expect what's going on here to be obvious, so let's break it down really quickly. MD-Find lets you use Spotlight search functionality from the terminal. Spotlight is essentially technology that's constantly running on your Mac and indexing files based on the keywords that are inside of them. So when you create a new document or you download a new document, you can often press Command and Spacebar on your keyboard, do a keyword search, and find that document without even knowing what the file name is, just by searching for the keyword. MD-Find is the command line tool you can use to go find those files based on keywords. So if an attacker gets on and they say, show me all files that are indexed by the word password, or all files indexed by the word routing and account, or in our case, go find all the files that contain the word confidential. We're then, as the attacker, we would then find the files on the system. We have 3 examples here, and we would take the results of this MD-Find search and pipe that to xargs. Xargs is a way to run another command basically on each individual result that comes back, usually on a line-by-line basis from the command line. So each of those files is going to be sent to xargs, which our xargs command then pipes all of those to tar. And tar is going to take those commands and add them one by one to an archive.tar file. So ultimately what that gives us is a new tar file, a new archive that's just loaded with confidential documents. And now, as an attacker, all we have to do is steal that single document, which is easier than exfilling multiple documents, something attackers know and often do when finding valuable documents to steal.
So that's our contraption. The user clicked on an email to download our malware dropper, which we packaged in a special zip file to avoid getting the quarantine. It was automatically unzipped by Safari, and we used a custom URL handler to convince the user to open it, which activated our agent and allowed us to search and capture every confidential file on the system to upload it to our attack server. So in the last portion of our talk, let's discuss how this could have been thwarted or at least detected using Jamf Protect. So what can Jamf Protect see? Let's start with that custom URL scheme. So a custom URL scheme, as we mentioned, is a pretty standard thing that an application will use. So we have essentially an informational alert that triggers every time a new application URL scheme is registered. Obviously, alone, this isn't going to be a cause for concern, but this is what you would see. We will show you what that URL scheme is. And what's worth noting is that this is more notable when it's paired up with other types of alerts, for example, like a Safari download of an application where it didn't receive a quarantine. So if you start to see some of these things linked together, that's when these types of informational alerts start to have more value in an investigation. So that's the custom URL scheme. Let's take a look at that gatekeeper bypass. So in this particular detection, simply what we're looking for is any new application that gets downloaded and unzipped automatically by Safari. And keep in mind, that's an automatic default behavior for a zip file to be automatically opened. The particular bypass required that feature to be turned on. So what we do is we check to see that the application that was downloaded has the quarantine bit. If this alert is triggered, what we want to look for is the file that triggered it. Keep in mind, the key thing here is that you are patched. It is possible that someone could find a new way to have an application that gets downloaded and not quarantined. So this detection is still valuable on the theoretical chance that a new bypass is discovered. But in theory, if you are updated to 12.3, like we mentioned, you should be safe from this type of an attack. It's also worth noting we talked about the CIS insights, and there is specifically one for that automatic default behavior of Safari being disabled. This is one that I think personally I recommend organizations would consider. It's not a huge headache to disable this for the user and can be done via Jamf Pro using a custom settings and application payload here. This is not a built-in one, but if you Google this plist is not hard to find to specify this particular default being disabled. There's also, it's worth noting, you can limit the chance that a user works around Gatekeeper by using this payload here to disable the overriding of Gatekeeper. So that's another one worth considering.
So next we'll talk about the fileless malware detection, and it's worth mentioning, of course, like if Mythic lands on the disk, Jamf Protect can use Yara to detect on it. But if the Mythic agent, like we used in this case, is reaching out and just sending that directly to an interpreter, then it's never hitting the disk and there's nothing to scan. So what we look for instead is we look for something like this, where curl is running, reaching out to the internet, pulling something down, and then the results of that are directly piped to an interpreter language. In this case, we see OSA script or Apple script using JavaScript or JXA JavaScript for automation. And between curl being run and JavaScript / OSA script kind of taking the results, this is very suspicious, and we want to make sure that we flag something like this. Next is going to be the evil MD find command. So how do we go about detecting this? Well, essentially every process has various process IDs associated with it. Many detection teams focus on the PID and the parent PID. For this detection, we actually use a cool process ID called the process group ID, which essentially lets us target a group of commands run together. What we do is look for any time an archive tool is run, in this case tar, and then we use the process group ID and follow it back to the process that has the matching PID. When this happens, we know that we have an archiving command that was run, and it was run at the end of essentially an MD find command, which is the exact technique we talked about. So we'll throw a detect on that as well anytime we see that occur. And those are our behavioral detections associated with this attack.
So that was our talk. We gave you a quick crash course in the fundamental phases of a macOS attack. We talked about how Jamf Protect is able to have visibility into those various phases. Then we showed you a realistic attack simulation and then mapped that simulation back to specific detections built into Jamf Protect. If this is a topic you're interested in learning more, we have some resources here available. There's a book that was recently published by Patrick Wardle called The Art of Mac Malware. Many of the concepts that were discussed here are covered in that book, as well as another book called OS 10 Incident Response, written by Jaron Bradley, who is on this talk as well. A very good discussion from an analyst point of view of a lot of ideas that were the basis for a lot of the detections that we use in Jamf Protect. Jaron also has a website called The Mitten Mac that has his research that's up to date. Patrick also has one called Objective-C. And if you'd like to get in contact with our team via Jamf Protect, check out our Mac admin Slack channel called #Jamf-Protect. We would love to get in contact with you to answer questions or talk about potential other detections. Thank you so much for joining us today on our talk.